All right. People enter the virtual chat room. All right. Hello, everybody. Welcome to Powerhouse Arena's virtual events. My name is Chris, and I am very pleased to be hosting the launch for the Immortals of Tehran by Ali Araghi. Thank you, everyone, for coming. You'll be able to ask questions through the chat or the Q&A function on your screen. You can also buy the book at powerhousebookstores.com. The link is in the event page, and it's reposted in the chat as well. Ali will be in conversation with Arash Azizi. Let me introduce them now. Arash Azizi is a writer, translator, and scholar living in New York City. His writings and commentary on politics, history, and cinema have appeared in numerous publications, including the BBC, Daily Beast, Jacobin, Toronto Star, Washington Post, and Al Jazeera. About a dozen of his book-length translations have appeared in Iran and abroad. Ali Araghi is an Iranian writer and translator. He earned his MA in Ancient Cultures and Languages at the University of Tehran and has translated Samuel Beckett into Persian. After completing his MFA from the University of Notre Dame, he is currently working on his PhD in Comparative Literature, International Writers Track at Washington University. He won the 2017 Perry Schooner Virginia Faulkner Award for Excellence in Writing and has published stories and translations in Perry Schooner, the Fifth Wednesday Journal, Asymptote, Hayden's Ferry Review, among others. He lives in St. Louis. Thank you.
There we go. All right. Thanks everyone for coming, and it's great to be with you, Ali, and thank you, Chris, for the introduction. So let's go ahead with it. So my suggestion is, let's talk for I'll ask you a few questions. Maybe we'll talk for 20 minutes, half an hour or so. Then maybe we can read a segment of your book, and then we can get some questions from the floor in any form that we can. I guess we'll bring Chris back for that to moderate there. But so Ali, let me, biography, let's just start with some basics. So you're known in Iran for your translations of Beckett and Richard Brautigan. You did also an MA in Ancient Languages in Tehran University. And, what made you interested in the first place in fiction and translating it to Persian? I mean, where does your interest in Beckett and Brautigan came from, and how did that link to your studies in Tehran University?
That's my whole life. I'm not sure if I can connect everything together, but I think I was interested in fiction from a very young age. I think I was in 5th grade elementary school in my composition class. There was this student who wrote stories, and I remember that I felt kind of envious of him for writing fiction in a composition class, and I remember that I tried to kind of imitate what the thing that he was doing. At that time, I remember I read some like Isaac Asimov, and like Jules Verne, simplified versions for kids back in Iran. And I remember I wrote some story that was placed in some far-fetched, far-off land. And I do remember that I had an atlas, not a map, not a globe, and I opened up the atlas and I found the kind of farthest place that I could think of. It was the Kamchatka Peninsula in Russia, and so I placed some submarine in there. So I think it goes way back, but it wasn't like a continuous thing. By the way, Zoom is telling me that my connection is not stable. If you lose me, just let me know and I'll pause and repeat. So it goes way back, but then I go to school, and at that time school was all about to take the university exam, which was this behemoth, this test that everybody took at the end of your high school to get into university. And if you kind of failed, they couldn't rank well. It was kind of equivalent to losing your future, having a terrible future. So like I remember, like in high school, all my attention was towards getting good grade in that exam and rank high, so I can get into some good school. And I kind of did. And I went into engineering, but I soon realized that that's not my cup of tea. And after I got into engineering, started studying, I felt that pressure of that exam kind of off of me, and I felt like I was going back towards literature little by little. And before that, at high school, also I wrote some poetry, but soon I realized I wasn't going to be a poet. Yeah, once in college, I started kind of going back towards literature, and that found its way in the shape of translation. So I started doing translation little by little, and after a little bit, I translated something by Ambrose Bierce that got published, which was not a good collection, and then Brodigan and Beckett. And at the same time, I started going to some fiction classes and writing my own fiction, which ended up in publishing my own collection of stories in Iran. And so that's how I ended up being a translator and a fiction writer. And then I moved here to the US to do an MFA in creative writing, University of Notre Dame.
Yeah, so let me take it from there. So yeah, you translate Texts of Nothing by Samuel Beckett to Persian, and you translate Old Vice by Richard Brodigan. You know, English language writers that have been popular in Iran. But yeah, let me come to the United States. So I guess you launched your sort of career in English language writing here. You've been published across. You won an award a few years ago. And now, of course, you have congratulations against a debut novel, very well received. As I'll talk about it, you've received some rave reviews across the board, and it's just the beginning. So congratulations on that again. But what was the process like of writing? Let me put it this way. So you're writing now obviously in a language that's not your mother tongue, but also I think a lot of us Iranians in America, or Iranian writers, there's this sort of, Iran is a country that is talked a lot about here. Of course, a lot of people have heard here and there things about it, but there's sort of this expectation of us to explain it, I guess, right? Or we have this urge even sometimes ourselves to explain it. And your novel very much is revolved around Iranian history. It's unlikely perhaps it would have been a very different novel had you written it in Persian, right? Or in that sort of environment. So yeah, how was that like? How was the start of your fiction writing life here in the United States? What took you to the topic that became this beautiful book, Immortals of Tehran?
I wasn't alien to writing in English. I started going to English classes when I was 12, and I was an English language teacher back in Iran for like 6 years. I taught English to little kids, like 11 to 13 years of age. So, and then a little bit before I moved here, I started this journal, Biography, that was supposed to be dedicated to Persian fiction translated into English. And so I had some experience translating Persian into English before I came here. And then, so when I started at Notre Dame, I was not a beginner like in writing in English. So I'm not saying it was easy, but it was I had some experience. So I had the option of writing, when I was at Notre Dame, writing my story, my fiction in Persian and translating it into English, but it was not practical because of the workload. I'm a very slow reader and writer. So I wrote originally in English, and this novel, when it started, was kind of an extension of that in the sense that I just started writing it in English. And it was kind of funny when I was working on the second draft, I thought I had this genius idea. I thought maybe I could write the second draft like in Farsi and then just translate it into English, and it would make everything much more, much quicker for me. But when I opened up a file, I was like, okay, now I'm gonna type it in Persian real quick. And I realized that I can't. And I was almost translating back my English into Farsi, and it was taking me very long to do that. So it was at that time that I was sure that this novel was conceived in English. That's not to say my English was very good, or it has nothing to do with that, but like the logic of English was what I had written the novel in. As for your second half of your question, the explanation, so that's another, I don't have a simple answer for it, but so the way I learned to write fiction was very much different from the style of this book. In those fiction workshops that I went to in Iran, like I kind of learned to write in a way of like show, don't tell, try to be as close to the bullseye, but never hit the bullseye, to kind of try to show what you want to say, but never say it. And I used to write like very concise fiction, a few pages. I was a short story writer, but my short story was very concise too. When I finished the first draft of this novel, I had it read by some of my professors in Notre Dame, some of my friends, and I realized that the structure was not working, and some of the comments were like I had taken too much for granted, and that maybe an average reader wouldn't, who's not very familiar with Iranian history and culture, wouldn't get enough of it. So I had to rewrite it with the thought of explaining more. And it was not easy for me because I'm the type of person when I finish something, I want it on the shelf like next week. I'm like so excited about it. Like, this is awesome. I want it out soon. So it was hard for me to think that I need to write it again and then change it and maybe expand it. But when I started to write, it kind of different style came through. This narrator, this kind of omniscient narrator that explains and allows itself to get into the headspace of the characters, or kind of zoom out to look at history, broad expanses of time. And I liked it actually. And I thought that maybe it's not a bad thing to that I'm trying to explain more. So I'm going to stop here because I think I'm talking too much. I'll give you some time to follow up, but I can talk a little bit more about this if you want.
No, definitely. Yeah, actually, let's continue the chat. So there is. Let me get to one of the reviews actually, because I think it's interesting. So in the Chicago Review of Books, your novel is called "A Great Multi-Generational and Nationalist." By nationalist, I think the reviewer basically means around the nation of Iran. I think that's sort of what they mean by it. And they compare you to Salman Rushdie's Midnight Children, Junot Diaz's Brief Wondrous Life of Oscar Wilde, and of course Gabriel Garcia Marquez's 100 Years of Solitude. So, so some great writers in there. But I want to know, what are some of the influences you had yourself in both Iran and here? What are some of the writing influences you had? And, your first project does have this epic sort of quality to it, and this magical realism. We'll get to talk about the cats, I hope, at some point. My sort of, when you're reading the book and the story of cats comes, it's really sort of gives you a jump. And it's interesting added element that you follow to the end. But what are some of the writerly sort of influences that you had yourself that set you on this path of writing such a sort of a grandiose novel about around Iranian history?
Yeah, I wasn't trying to write a nationalistic novel, and for what it's worth, I think the novel even tries to kind of set a type of mythological kind of logic, which even I could maybe claim that it kind of erases the idea of borders and boundary in a nation. At least that's how I like to think about it. So I was not trying to write a nationalistic novel at all. But like in terms of influences, Marquez was actually one of the big influences, and more specifically his 100 Years of Solitude, and one more, like a more specific influence of him was the kind of voice that he used in that novel, and like it was in the way that like there were days that I was trying to get into my daily writing quota mode, and I couldn't, like, had a kind of like small blogger difficulty getting started. I would just like open the book randomly and even read a few like one sentence or one or two sentences, and that was the voice that would kind of inspire me to kind of get into the mood of this novel and this narrator. So I would say 100 Years of Solitude was one big influence. But there were others too. Murakami, I'm a big fan of Murakami. I read a lot of Borges, Jorge Luis Borges, and there were others too. But yeah, I would say Marquez was big.
So to get to this magical element that we talked about, so this is a multi-generational novel. We start with hearing Ahmad is at the center. Of course, we hear about his great grandfather and sort of. And we go forward like that. But at some point, then we have the elements of cats. For those who haven't read the novel, a group of cats set up an independent country on the around borders of Iraq and Syria, and things get pretty exciting. Not to spoil, but you know, they have an important role in development of Middle Eastern history that you might have not known about. So, what do you think, Ali? What does that do for you to bring this? Magical element, of course, to bring this extra sort of real element? How does that help you tell the story? What's important for in Iranian literature? We have examples of like Samad Behrangi, for example, the Iranian writer who I'm sure you know, who you know, for him, who's a socialist writer, the magic seems to be, you know, pushes what he wants to get done, but is not able to, you know, because of constraints of reality. Then, you know, sort of the magical element does it. For Marquez, of course, it does a very different job. For you, what is the sort of the cats and the extra real elements? What do they do?
So if you allow me, I'm going to talk a little bit about the novel, like maybe introduce it to some people who may not know much about it. So the kind of elevator pitch. This is a multi-generational family saga, like Arash said, set in Iran. It spans from the Second World War to the 1979 Iranian Revolution, and a few years after that. There's a family in the novel that is apparently under some age-old curse. As a result of the curse, every other son in the family dies young, and the other lives as if forever. We follow the life of Ahmad, who's apparently one of these immortals, from when he's 10 to when he becomes a famous poet, and then later becomes interested in politics and becomes the youngest member of the parliament to the revolution. And but there are a lot of different characters too. The cast of characters is actually rather large. There's a family tree at the beginning of the novel, and there are upwards of 30 names on that family tree alone. So it's not, my point is that this is not a novel only about one person or one hero. It's about a big cast of characters. And like I said, the novel implies that whatever happened in contemporary Iranian history was the doing of cats, not people. So there's a subplot of cats doing fishy things. To get back to your story, Arash, so I think an honest answer to this would be that I'm very much interested in fictional worlds that are a little bit maybe fabulous, not 100% realistic. So that's, I think, partly comes from my interest in that kind of, extra real, to use your word, elements of fiction. But also, I think the tools of magic realism allowed me to create the world that I was hoping to do. So these cats were one of the main images that I started writing the novel with, and to kind of imply that and play with the concept of history that I wanted to do. I think it wanted the tools of magic realism allowed me to do what I wanted to do, to kind of imply the subplot of cats, and to kind of create that kind of fiction. Like I talked about the kind of mythological logic of the book. So to create that space, I think these tools of magic realism would allow me to create this world that would make sense in and of itself as a whole.
And you've talked about Hayden White, of course, known for his, Hayden White is a historian. I was excited to see you talk about him, of how he says even history is fiction. So, I mean, the oversimplification on my part, but but he basically said, a historian always has to effectively find a, not fiction, sorry, find a novel-like form. And then, of course, he has his elaborate theories of, comedy, tragedy. So actually, if, now that you're familiar with Hayden White, let me ask you, what form is Iranian history, do you think? Is it a tragedy? Is it a comedy? Is it what novel form do you think best will explain the history of our country?
Well, I need to say, I need to put out the disclaimer that I'm not an expert in Hayden White. I read just a little bit of him, and I know this is your area. So I don't claim any expertise or familiarity with him, but I was very much interested in his idea that, again, correct me if I'm wrong, but the idea, my understanding of him, that historical writing uses much of the techniques of narrative, of fictional narrative. So when we use so like history is a kind of continuum, it's kind of life is a kind of continuum. And when you write a piece, a text that is, and you label it as historical, you do certain things, like as a very beginning, like very primary thing, you determine a beginning, an end, and middle. This very simple fact means that has a lot of meaning consequences to it. So it means that you as a writer decide where something begins and put an emphasis on it, and where something ends, put an emphasis on that. And then when you write about a certain person or a certain event, of course, history is not about one person, it's not about one event. It's a multitude and infinite connections between people. And one of the actually one of the premises of this novel, the way that you have so many characters and the narrative threads kind of weaving to one another, and hopefully smoothly kind of changes from one character to another character, is a kind of reflection on this idea that history is not necessarily about one person, but actually it's the experience of lived life of a lot of individuals that makes that history. So that was part of what I was doing. And Cats also kind of introducing that outrageous claim that it was cats that were behind anything that happened in Iran is hopefully brings up this question that what is it that, like, when I read the history of the revolution or whatever history, what is it that I'm reading? Who is the person that wrote that history? Are there agents that have been deleted from this frame? Is there anything outside this frame that I'm not paying attention to? And I don't know about the overall picture of Iranian history. It sounds like a tragicomic type of thing. It's tragical, definitely, but it's comic too. keeps repeating itself. Yeah, I don't know. I need to think more about that.
Well, thank you very much for that. Yeah, it's Shakespeare meets Mel Brooks, perhaps, but you know, we certainly have both tragic and comic elements. I mean, I want to get to you reading your reading a section of the book and then questions from the floor. But let me just end with ask my last question. Before that, though, I will point to another review, which is interesting. Publishers Weekly calls your book a skillful combination of revolutionary politics and magical realism, which will please the fans of Alejo Carpentier, the great Cuban writer who's known for the novels he wrote about Cuba and also his intense interest in musicology. He is a key figure of Latin American literature of 20th century. So yeah, that's Carpentier for you, another great novelist to be compared to. But so, you know, I want to sort of and ask my last question, mostly perhaps a bit more future oriented. So now, you know, the first book is out. It's a great feat. You know, how do you have quite a few projects coming up, and you know, there's quite a few things you're doing. There's a great encyclopedia sorts website that you run about Persian literature translated to English. And I want to sort of end around this. As an Iranian American writer, you know, how do you see the future of your literary career? Do you think about writing in Persian again as well? Do you think about also writing in English? Do you think about introduction of literature from Iran to English? How do you see the future of your literary career?
In an ideal world, I would love to be a novelist. I don't know how that's going to pan out, but we'll see. That's a very good question. The question of like whether what language to write in. When I was writing this, I was not sure if I was doing the right thing writing in my non-native language. But I did. I felt like I need to finish this and then decide what I'm going to do later. And honestly, I'm not 100% sure still if I'm doing the right thing. But I can tell that I think it depends. It depends on what kind of reactions, what kind of feedback I get from this in the near future. And there was some talk of like translating this into Farsi, and people are asking me, "Are you going to translate this?" And I feel like no, it's not. I don't feel like I'm going to translate this at the moment. Maybe things change. Maybe I change my idea in the future, but for now, I don't think so. And I feel like I may want to try writing the next thing, hopefully also in English. But again, I'm still not sure if I'm doing the right thing. Mostly because, so one reason for me to write in English is because I haven't done any heavyweight lifting in Persian in the past 8 years since I moved here. I definitely feel like I've lost some of my capabilities. I'm not saying that I'm forgetting my mother tongue or anything like that, but I don't think I'm like that strong in it as I used to be. The other thing is that actually I feel like writing in English without those capabilities, actually kind of sometimes helps me write better in terms of just kind of the obsession that I have with words and the kind of uncertainty that I have, like if I'm using the right word. So I need to check and double check every word that I'm writing, that I'm using. Like I use thesaurus a lot, and is there a better word to use? Like I remember there was this word, there was a better word for this sentence, but I don't know what it was. So I'm going, like, I check and double check, and I think that constant consulting with dictionary, with thesaurus actually helps me write better. So yeah, so the answer would be, I think I'm going to try to write in English the next one, whenever that will be. And I think I forgot what your next question was.
I mean, it's, you know, no, I think you answered my question mostly. I mean, you know, I also mentioned the fact again that you helped translate Persian fiction to English, and that you run a website that is a catalog. I mean, I think it would go beyond the scope of this conversation. The question of, you know, Persian translated fiction to English, and why is it perhaps, why it hasn't been, I mean, if you want to get a bit nationalistic about a lot of Iranians, they're like, why haven't we had our, Orhan Pamuk, why we haven't had, why is it that translated Persian fiction in English hasn't really done well, right? On grand level, in a way that people really expected it to do, perhaps. But then again, even in Iran, as we know, a lot of, there's a lot of fiction happening in Iran, but perhaps the rise of great sort of novelists, as we had from the previous generation, is something that we really haven't had yet in Persian. But I think that would go beyond the scope of the conversation. But I'll leave it for you if you have any other words. But it'd be great if you now read a passage from your novel, and then we can have Chris back to do some question and answers from the floor.
Sure. But I'm happy to touch on that project a little bit. That the project is for now called Persian Translated, and it's actually part of my academic work as a PhD student at WashU. And I'm hoping to create a database of, like you said, Persian literature translated into English on the level of metadata, kind of granular metadata, like title, author, translator, editors, place of publication, time of publication, even word count, as granular as you can. So, and it's supposed to be some tool for both researchers in either Persian language or Persian literature, or just people interested in translation studies, and also people just who are just interested in Persian literature in general.
I shared the links down there of your personal website and also of Persian Translated, so that those who are interested could. And I think it's a very valuable resource. But if I shared it online, and certainly the community of people who teach about Iranian universities, we're very excited.
Thank you. It's still in progress. I need to work on it and make it an actual database, searchable, sortable. So it's I'm still collecting data and doing that too. Okay, so I'm gonna read a very short piece. Let me show the cover for a few seconds. I'm gonna read a very short excerpt from the novel. So this is a part. Okay. The character that we have here is Majid. You don't need to know much back history about this scene, except that at this point there are some protests going on outside in the streets. But this Majid character is not a very politically minded at this point. He's a cinephile. He loves the movies. He just finds himself in the movies whenever he can find time. So yeah, this is the beginning of a chapter, and that's, I think, all we need to. Oh, and we are in a movie theater, so that's it. 2 weeks before the next summer, Majid was at the theater as the streets were being beaten under the shoes of the people who marched ahead and the boots of the soldiers and officers who would not retreat. The lover on the screen was walking in quiet sidewalks, struggling with the question in his heart. Should one leave one's beloved if one is certain that another man will give her a better life? With every step of the lover on the carpet of the dry orange and red leaves, a calm crunching sound reverberated in the theater. It was at that moment when Majid felt his seat was shaking, and before he had the time to complain in his head that someone was kicking from behind again, the whole theater trembled. The wall behind the screen fell with a loud rumble. A tank came in through the screen, and Majid found himself in the middle of the uprising. The tank stopped on top of the debris with a hiss, coughing up a puff of smoke. Somehow the screen was not detached from what kept it in place. Ripped and crumpled, the white sheet was still hanging behind the tank. Outside in the daylight, people ran back and forth across the street. The hatch opened, and the tank driver, a young soldier in a khaki army uniform, scrambled out and jumped down. In shock, he looked around at his tank in the cloud of dust and smoke, the fallen wall, the moviegoers who were running away in panic, and the persistent scream that now displayed a vague shadow show of the commotion outside, overlaid by a pale picture of the lover in the leaves. The driver ran toward the back exits, where those previously watching the movie were now pushing one another. Majid, who had sprung up onto his seat at some point, ran and joined the fleeing crowd. Resting his palms on the back of the man in front of him for support while being shoved ahead by scared bodies, Majid made his way out of the hall and ran up the stairs. The door to the projection booth was left half open. He looked around. The room was empty. He jumped in, turned the projector off, took the reels out, and snapped them into the rewinder. While the rewinder whirred, he collected the other 5 reels of the movie. From the little window through which the projector shot its beam at the screen, Majid looked down. Except for some curious people from the street who climbed the rubble to get close to the tank, there was no one in the theater. Outside the projection room, someone ran past the door. When he heard the slapping of the end of the film on the body of the rewinder, Majid turned the machine off, fitted the last reel into a case, and snapped the lid closed. Without trying to hide his armful of cases, he walked out of the door and down the stairs. "Hey, hey," said the box office ticket seller, bending over to put his mouth to the opening. "What are those?" "I have to see the end," Majid said before running away awkwardly, a stack of 6 reel cases in his arms. The ticket seller went back to staring at what was unraveling in the street outside his cubicle. Even if he had stepped out, he would soon have given in to exhaustion and lost the young man among the bodies that strove to change history. Yeah, I think this is it for now. I can get another excerpt later.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for a beautiful moving phrase. I also remember it from the book. I was looking to have a link of the book. I'll put a few links here that people can help to purchase the book on different platforms. I think it's good for most platforms in North America. I see we have some guests from Canada as well attending. So thank you very much, Ali. You want to show the cover of your book again? And I think we have a beautiful. It's up to the questions from the floor. Chris, would you like me to start getting the questions, or would you like to come in as moderator? Maybe because the first questions is asked, let me just ask it and then we can see. If anyone wants to speak as well, like speak with voice, if anyone wants to speak with voice or with video, please raise your hand, use the function to raise your hand, or right here and we'll bring you. A person whose name is in Hebrew, I imagine is Etan, if I read it right. It says, would love to know more about the writing of the novel as translator, not only from Persian to English and vice versa, but how did you approach the language of the novel? Yeah, I think it's a fascinating question. Writing the novel as a translator, and the question of approaching language. I think you talked a little bit about that, but it'd be great to hear more.
Sure. I'm thinking I'm thinking about writing a novel as a translator. So in kind of, well, I'm gonna look, if I take it literally, I was a translator, I was a published translator in Iran and here. But there are some other levels of translation that I'm thinking about. Like first, like one level would be the level of textual level, where it's the kind of common thing that you see when someone speaks in a second language. You can sometimes discern the structures and words and expressions from the native language that gets can literally translate it into the second language. So there's that aspect of it, or like the way some people think in Persian or in their first language, and then kind of try to say the same words, the same phrases into the second language. So there's that kind of layer of translation. And there's another kind of aspect to it being how to translate that experience, or like, well, the history of Iran that I was working with, or the kind of mentality or the kind of culture, that kind of world that I knew, being like Iranian, or like in Tehran at least. I can't claim I'm writing like about Iran, because like I can't even claim that I'm writing about Tehran. It's just like a very small fraction of the city that I know. So, but to get back to it, kind of how to translate that kind of culture into this new language. So these were all, well, in terms of the first one, the kind of textual, I didn't have that much trouble, because I don't think that I'm thinking in Persian now when I'm writing. So I think senses come to my head in English. But obviously, how to translate the culture, that was a question that I think I kind of took it somewhat instinctively as I wrote, with this knowledge that I'm writing for a reader that is not very much interested, very much aware of, or doesn't know much about this culture. So one example that a friend of mine gave me, she read the novel, and she was like, there was a scene where there's a kind of proposal ceremony where the family of the suitor goes to the family of the girl, and they talk, and then there's one moment where traditionally the girl brings in tea for the guests. And so the tradition is you start with the guests, and you start with the elderly. So the first, if there's a like older member and the guest, you just offer them tea, and then perhaps you to the elder in your family. So there's this age hierarchy, and I say that, I explicitly say that like she starts with the elder. And my friend was like, she noticed that this thing that I'm doing, and she was like, if she was thinking that if I'd written this in Persian, I wouldn't have done that, because that's kind of common knowledge between among my readers. So there are these moments like that where I think knowingly or unknowingly I have done these kind of translations, which in this case could translate into kind of expansion of a text. So yeah, there are these moments in the novel that if you look, that I mean we could put our fingers on.
Yeah, certainly. Let's see if we have more questions from the floor. I should say that now the reality of English, of course, is that it is a language in which many people are now writing, in their second language, and some of the great writing in English comes both from people who are from the sort of across the British Empire, really. Like if you think about Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie from Nigeria, or Arundhati Roy from India, or these are people whose mother tongue is English because they grew up in English language countries. But now we have many people who write in English, and I think it is shaping up to be its own branch of the language. Not to mention many of the great classics whose mother tongue was not English. Vladimir Nabokov comes to mind. Of course, he created a great masterpiece, Lolita, and other works. And I think English, by many ways, was his third language, actually, because he spoke Russian and French much better. If there are, let's see if there are more questions. If there are no more questions, we can have maybe we can have another short reading of your thing before wrapping up.
Sure.
Are there more questions from the floor? You can either ask in a video fashion or audio, or you can write here and I will read your question out loud. I'll give it a minute. Yeah, while we have you here, it'd be great if you can do a reading. I think there are any more questions. So yeah, I think it would be great if we end by another reading.
Yeah, I'm going to read another short excerpt, and in the meantime, if someone has any questions, I'll be happy to answer. And if not, we'll call it night. So in this excerpt, it's it's a wedding scene. The main character of the novel, Ahmad, it's his birthday. He's marrying Homa. The characters that we need to know about in this scene are, of course, Ahmad and Homa. We have Khan, Ahmad's grandfather, great uncle, Homa's mother's uncle, and Colonel Deldar, who's Homa's father. Like I said, we're in an orchard. There's a building. The bride and groom's room is inside that building, and most of the women are there. And one other thing that I didn't say about the novel is that Ahmad, something terrible happens to him in the beginning of the novel, and he loses his voice. And he doesn't speak for the rest of the novel. And so at this point, Ahmad does not speak. Music slipped out of vibrating strings and throbbing percussive skin from under restless picks and hands. Great uncle reached into his breast pocket and threw a fistful of bills into the air, then a second. Children dived to collect the money from under the stomping feet. Seeing this, Khan left the circle and strode away from the celebration. Outside, he motioned for the chauffeur to open the trunk of the white Jaguar. Back at the dance, the crowd split open to let in Khan and his driver boy, who carried 2 sacks under his arms. Khan dug his hand into one, and bills flew into the air. Children ran around trying to catch them as they spun like raining pinwheels. The great uncle emptied his pockets and then motioned at Colonel Deldar for more. As the evening proceeded, more nimble-fingered musicians performed. The cool fall breeze could not dry sweat off of dancing bodies. Until the last one dropped down panting, Khan and great uncle showered bells on the dancers. So much money was dispensed that after the wedding was over and the last of the guests had left, the owner of the orchard spent a sunset to sundown excavating bills from under mud and dirt. The last player of the night was Maester Shahnaz. After the dinner tables were cleared, a humble wooden chair was placed for him in the middle of the open space. The night was calm, except for the murmur of those outside, and the chatter of those inside, and the chirping of the creatures of the night. The maester approached his chair with slow, calm steps and sat himself down, eyes cast down. He crossed his legs and balanced his tar on his thigh. A silence fell over the wedding as he turned the pick in his hand and took a deep breath, his head bent toward his instrument. With the first strum of his pick on the strings, the dead branches of the trees turned soft, and before the end of the overture, green shoots had sprouted on them. A few scales into the rhythmic piece, blossoms opened on the leafless trees. The music was almost visible, floating in the breeze, weaving in and out of the plum trees, billowing the curtains into the house, scaling up the women's legs, and wafting around their bosoms. Suddenly, happy cries rose from the bride and groom's room. The bride's dress had bloomed. Homa's mother kept picking the blossoms from her veil so she could see. Ahmad smiled at Homa and got up from beside her to look at the maestro through the window. The orchard was carpeted with orange and plum blossoms that grew and fell from the trees. A pinkish white petal sat on the maestro's bald head. "We will be happy together," Homa whispered in Ahmad's ear when he sat back by her. Ahmad took her hand and gave it a gentle but firm squeeze. "This is a sign." The newlyweds boarded the automobile that Mohammad Reza had rented for the wedding ride. Parked right outside the orchard, the Jaguar, too, like all the other cars, had grown little flowers on its handles, trunk, and hood. Sitting in the back seat, Ahmad and Homa circled the streets of the city in the mirth of their unity. Years later, after the revolution and the 8-year war had already become history, when Ahmad walked the streets of the megalopolis of Tehran and saw how people decorated their wedding cars by tapping gladioli to the hoods, trunks, and door handles, he felt an urge to write on a piece of paper and show the person next near the person nearest him, that's the doing of Maestro Shahnaz. You should have seen the orchard that night. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have one more question, and we'll perhaps end it there. I'm sorry, I should have seen this earlier. No, I think it was asked after you started reading. I also am not very familiar with this software because it came to me. Anyways, I think the Mitra asks, what's the genre of your book? I think we talked a little bit about that, but yeah, how would you define in terms of genre? Where do you think it stands? Where do you think it stands?
I think magical realism is one, like my go-to term when I talk about this. Well, genre fiction was not a big thing in Iran, at least when I was growing up. And I don't think it's as prominent as here. So it's literary fiction that with hints of, it's very real with hints of magical elements in it. We call it like magical realism would be an appropriate term to talk about this work.
Beautiful. Thank you very much, Ali. We also have a raised hand. Alison would like to speak. Alison, the floor is yours. There we go. Sorry, I didn't know how this works. There we go.
Hi, Ali.
I wondered, it just occurred to me as you were reading, I wondered where this idea for music causing things to bloom, and also the idea of poetry causing fire and art sort of causing things to change form. If you remember how that came to you or what it meant to you.
Sure, thank you, Ellie. As for so music is like this scene that I read. It's a small kind of scene that doesn't become a major thread in the novel. I'm gonna get to the poetry thing that you mentioned. I think I used to play the same instrument, the tar, and I liked it a lot. At some point, I remember I had to decide between music or literature. I decided that I need to spend long hours every day if I wanted to become even a half decent musician. And also I needed to spend a lot of time on literature if I wanted to write well. And so at that point I decided I wanted to become a writer. So I stopped playing the tar. So I think part of it comes from my own interest in the first Persian traditional music and the instrument, and also this specific maestro who was like perhaps one of the most famous tar players in Iran. So that this little scene was kind of, and also his appearance in the novel is kind of my homage to him. But like Alison said, there's this, Ahmad, the main character, becomes a poet, and he starts to write better and better poetry. He finds the light under the words, and he writes poetry that literally gives off light. And the way he writes better poetry is by judging how much light it gives off. So he erases words and crosses out words and writes other words. So if the poem shines more brightly, it's a better poem. And it gets better and better until one day the poem burns the paper that he's writing on, and later it burns even cardboard, and he has to etch the poet on metal. So there's this idea, there's this kind of literal fire that comes from the poetry, and actually one of the poems becomes very important during the revolution. Actually, just a little bit for those who don't know about the novel, but I don't know how it came to me. Yeah, I'm trying to think. No, I don't know. I don't know how it came to me. Maybe I'll remember later, but I don't remember. I think it was one of those things that I was like, oh, it kind of makes sense, you know, the better a work of art is, the more fiery it is, the more energy it has. So I think there was like maybe the confluence of these words and terms and these ideas about what good literature is kind of translated into this idea of energy, fire, and it became kind of literal. The kind of magic realism, magic realistic world allowed this kind of perhaps metaphorical fire and energy to become something real, something literal fire and real in this novel. But I'll keep thinking about it and see if I can find some moment of inspiration for the fire, but I don't think that I know right now.
Beautiful. Thank you very much, Ali. Seeing no further questions, I think we can call it a night again. Thanks a lot for Powerhouse Books, Powerhouse Arena Bookstore. Beautiful. There we go. We have Chris here. He can maybe again talk, just wrap it up and also mention the fact that you can buy you can buy books. I just want to say, for myself as a book lover and as a writer, my little pitch is that, since the virus began, of course, the streaming services, Netflix, they saw many more customers, much more for the books. This wasn't immediately the case. And again, if you love the books, there's no better way than to support them and to get them, and to do so through supporting the bookshops like Powerhouse Arena that we love. And I hope, we all hope that this situation will end and we'll be able to go to bookshops soon as well. But meanwhile, you can certainly get your favorite books online through Powerhouse, including Immortals of Tehran. So I'll end it here, Ali. If I were you, I would show the cover of the book one more time, and I'll leave it for Chris.
Okay, can I thank some people? Okay, thanks. Thanks for Powerhouse Arena for hosting this. Thank you, Arash. I would like to thank Melville House, my publisher, Allison Lewis, my agent, Ryan, my editor. Both Allison and Ryan made this book a better book than it was before. Thank you, everyone.
Great. Thank you so much. Thank you, Ali. Thank you, Arash. And thank you for everyone who asked questions. If you missed any of the event, it'll be on YouTube very soon. And please buy the book through the link in the chat, and it's also in our event page. It'll be 10% off for a short time, and it'll help fund more events like this online and hopefully in person soon. Thank you.
Thank you very much, everybody. Shab bakhair.
Thank you.
Shab bakhair.